Before we begin our step-by-step look at the planet and its many systems, we must first attempt how we fit into this larger natural picture. Today we'll be examining the basics of our chief mode of perception, in this case the scientific method. What we discussed in our last lecture and what we'll be looking at today will provide us with the conceptual framework with which we will be able to understand the world around us. To understand the relationship that human beings have with the world around them, we have to place ourselves within a variety of forces that shape landscapes and forces that maintain life on the planet. This means that as we progress through the content of the coursework, we have to take a look at society and culture and the larger abiotic and biotic spheres which seem to encapsulate it. We have to understand something about human society and its relationship with the biosphere. Let's take a closer look at some of these terms and concepts. When I use the term biotic, basically I am referencing or relating my comments to something that is relatable to living things in this case within the biosphere of this planet. That is juxtaposed to abiotic, which describes things that are physical and yet non-biological, things that are not derived necessarily from living matter. What we have to keep in mind is that an ecosystem, which is basically the functional unit of analysis in these opening lectures for us, and it will be an important unit of analysis when we start looking closely at the biosphere. The ecosystem is composed of both biotic and abiotic things, and it organizes these things or interacts with these things or is part of their interaction in a very systematic way. So an ecosystem is a cycle of the interaction between matter and energy. It includes all living things and their relationship with the non-living matter that surrounds them. So to get at this interaction, there's a variety of qualities, things that physical geographers attempt to understand. It really becomes their research aims in a sense. First, they want to understand something about the physical nature of the planet itself. This is where concepts like geology really start to play an important role in our studies. They want to understand something about the Earth's atmosphere and its relationship to not only the energy that we receive from the sun, but how the atmosphere as a kind of all-inclusive filter helps to drive the changes we see in landscapes over time. We'll want to understand and organize our landforms, at least those that we observe, measure, and study. And then, of course, we want to situate life within this equation. We want to take a look at the Earth's biosphere, reconstruct it, classify, and categorize it. And a physical geographer then frames all of these concepts within a locational or spatial model. These aims or concerns then result in 5 spatial themes, and you'll see how these 5 spatial themes play out in both your readings, some of your laboratory activities, and of course the topics that we cover, the places that we look more closely at, the regions and specific qualities of those regional landscapes. The first of our 5 spatial themes is location. This is the absolute and relative location of areas on the planet. Many of our technologies today are oriented around the ability that we have to know where we are, kind of our planetary address. GPS technologies and of course GIS technologies allow us to document this information. The next spatial theme could be considered to be a unit of region. Regions are locations that are organized by landscape models or regional models. They possess unified characteristics. So the American Northwest Coast, for example, is a similar shoreline landform to what we see in association with the Canadian Rockies or the Canadian coastlines to the north, or even the coastline system in Northeast Asia. By organizing landscapes into regional models, we allow ourselves the ability to recognize kind of larger areas of the Earth and its surface. It allows us to discuss locations outside of our own kind of human political interests and organize them by natural features. You will find that these natural regions will cut across locational boundaries, boundaries of latitude and longitude, for example. Our next spatial theme would be local place. It's not oxymoronic, but it is our interest in understanding local living and non-living characteristics of a physical place. We attempt to understand that, in a sense, no two places on the globe are alike, and that each of us can understand these unique locations in relation to local meanings, so whether they're natural or social in nature. It is within this third local landscape theme that we then begin to apply things like latitude and longitude, or we associate a local microclimate with a nearby watershed. A fourth theme would be, or would embody in a sense, the concept of physical movement, how materials and energies flow across the Earth's surface. We can localize this to particular regions or very local landscapes. But what we're seeing in this fourth kind of spatial theme is the concept of interlinkages that exist between all natural and organismal systems. Even with systems themselves, there is a movement and flow, and we take a closer look at that. We look at how wind and wave action occurs and how it actively circulates energy in water. And I've included this satellite image of a hurricane to express or typify this kind of concept of physical movement. So in the body of the hurricane, we see both a natural and an organismal process of movement. We see the movement of water and wind. We see the hazardous nature of organisms attempting to live in regions of the planet where hurricanes become common. The latter portion of our lecture series will take a look at how a hurricane forms and how it moves across, in this case, warm tropical waters. So the hurricane itself represents a kind of relationship, a very unique, very chaotic or dynamic relationship between material and energy. In our fifth and final spatial theme, we see the interaction between living organisms and their environment. This is also a location where we see the human-Earth relationship recognized. In your readings, in applied assignments, and of course in our lecture series, we will address this concept of how physical locations are home to specific kinds of organisms, how they interact with the biotic and abiotic qualities of those biological spaces, and how they are best adapted for those environments. Throughout all of these forms of spatial analysis, we see a very important functional unit, which is the ecosystem. As I mentioned before, the ecosystem is a cycle of matter and energy that includes all living organisms and their relationship to the non-living matter in their environments. It's important because, again, it is something that we too experience. There is a kind of human ecology. We have adapted, in a sense, to our unique ecosystems. And again, these would be ecosystems that would be embedded in a variety of climate types. Let's look at one particular biochemical phenomenon within our atmosphere. We know that carbon is a basic element of life here on the planet. Carbon is an important basic element associated with all living things. At the heart of the global carbon cycle is the concept of interaction. There is a relationship that exists within this biochemical cycle. In this case, carbon is transferred from carbon dioxide to living matter, and then back again as carbon dioxide. It begins when carbon dioxide, that is part of the atmosphere, is in a sense photosynthesized into carbohydrate compounds. It's assimilated. Photosynthesis becomes a very important process. We associate it again with how plants respire. Soil, even water, in a sense, becomes a repository for carbon. And so carbon is, in this case, an important part, chemically, of a variety of ecosystems. Across the planet, carbon is constantly moving from inorganic reservoirs, which include soils, especially in the north, to living systems, and then back again. When we take a look at the nature of soils in the northern hemisphere of the planet, we realize that they become a very important source for the storing of carbon. They become a very important organic and inorganic area within the global carbon cycle. Local temperatures and even the amount of moisture that exists in expressions of the atmosphere in specific ecosystems will impact how the carbon cycle functions. The all-important compound in this equation, CO2, is in a sense impacted by things like temperature and moisture. If we have an increase in moisture in the lower atmosphere in a particular environment, we'll see a decrease in the amount of efflux or outward flow of this compound. If we see an increase, we see a corresponding increase in this outward flow as well. We see fluctuations also in spatial and temporal qualities of the hydrologic cycle. Respiration rates, especially those associated with plants, will vary across environment types. As we have seen the human part of the equation change, as we have seen, in a sense, our impact on this biochemical and geochemical cycle change, we see a change in how plants respire. We see respiration rates of CO2 in both the northern and southern hemisphere of the planet, in a sense, increasing as we clear cut forests, as we continue to utilize the fossil fuels at the level that we do. Even the increases that we have seen with wildfires as century-long droughts are now on record, we see this respiration rate increase. So we see a lot more, in this case, carbon entering the atmosphere. And correspondingly, we see less and less of it being stored in soils and plants. What this means for us is that a particular chemistry of a variety of ecosystems across the planet is now interacting with those ecosystems in a very different way. Change is dynamic, it's constant, and it's very pervasive. However, organisms living within these ecosystems adapt to these changes. Even human beings, our culture has changed as a result of changes within these chemical environments. Industries, for example, today are attempting to use below ground inorganic forms of carbon storage, a particular kind of industrial practice known as carbon sequestration. But it is a dynamic relationship. The organisms, as they continue to adapt within their ecosystems to a change in the chemical nature of the local atmosphere, will also begin to impact how that chemistry is experienced or how it is behaving within that natural environment. As a result of these dynamic, systematic interactions, physical geographers have to diversify how they study natural and cultural phenomenon. They have to take a look at things like the hydrogen cycle, the oxygen cycle, the carbon cycle through a very holistic lens, and they have to take a look at all of the many variables that are interacting in that systematic way, shaping not only the ecosystems embedded regionally within those unique biochemical and geochemical environments, but also the impact on local and global scales. As a result, we see a wide variety of specializations within the field of physical geography. specializations that look at these processes, how they are acting and interacting with one another, and the many mechanisms that are at work, fashioning them over time. We see the work of biogeographers, climatologists, meteorologists, soil geographers, zoogeographers, climate historians, anthropologists, and chemists, all focusing on this very holistic understanding of the world around us.